Hello everyone, I'm Drew Kreisman and welcome to my Final Fantasy VII Rebirth Q&A. Got some questions here from the Discord and some from Twitter on a myriad of topics, and I'm sure I'll randomly think of a few other observations that I want to share. And anything else that I think of that I want to put a cap on this entire conversation about Rebirth for, I may do an extra podcast, but I wanted to get to these questions because they range from the incredibly large to the incredibly specific, and this won't have anything to do with the very end of the game because I already talked about that on another show. That said, so check that out if you want that conversation, but this will be pretty full of spoilers. I'm going to try to backload those, so I'm going to talk about some of the things here up front that are a little more ambiguous, but yeah, by midway through the conversation, if you haven't finished it and you're particularly sensitive to spoilers, there are a couple of things particularly related to some of these questions about the differences between the original and this remake project that I want to talk about. Our first question is in that category, but I am going to keep it a little more ambiguous at first. And it comes from Brad, who asks, how much would you say your love of Rebirth is related to your love of the original Final Fantasy VII? And how much is it truly just a special game on its own merits? Now, this is probably going to be also the most difficult question to answer today because I don't know. I don't really know to what extent nostalgia and not even love of just the original Final Fantasy VII, but how about my love of Final Fantasy in general, right? There are people out there who would tell you that my love of the franchise impacts how I feel about every game. And it's the reason I refuse to be critical of Final Fantasy XVI or things like that, right? I just love that game. I loved Final Fantasy XVI so stupid much. And I love Rebirth so stupid much. And it's very difficult for me to know. That said, I felt like, as compared to Remake, much more of what I loved about Rebirth was stuff that was either totally new or done differently, added into the conversation. Okay, so mild spoilers, I'm not going to get into specifics how, and this begins early, right? But something that Ira and I talked about when we covered the original game is that one of the things that story could have done better, leaves as a loose end, or maybe arguably underdevelops, is why Tifa never really talks to anybody else about the fact that what Cloud is saying doesn't add up. And of course they added that to Rebirth, right? I've already talked in other conversations about the added development we're getting for Yuffie, Red 13, Barrett, huge stuff for Barrett and Dyne in Rebirth, right? I really loved what they did with that whole thing. So for me, I feel like I can confidently say that Rebirth is a tremendous gem and a masterpiece on its own. That said, if I was pushed to say, why are there moments of the day or particular days where there are certain things about the 16 experience that stood out a little bit more, it would be on that, right? Because there's no way to not be anticipatory. I don't know if that's a word. You're sitting there. I know the story. I'm looking for Midgar's armor. I'm anticipating the reveal of the gold saucer and coming upon Cosmo Canyon. These are all things I know are going to happen, and I have a visual in my mind of how it happened the first time, and I have a projection in my mind about how it might. And yes, a lot of the success of this game is either in matching or exceeding those expectations, right? But there are a lot of things, and we're going to get into some of the specifics and some of these other questions. New characters, new pieces of music, new events that unfold, new mini games, right? That I do think the game stands absolutely on its own merits, and it's something that I would 100 billion times over recommend to anyone who looks at the old Final Fantasy VII and goes, I'm not sure I can get into that because the graphics are old and because I don't like turn-based or slow combat. I would still tell people, play the remake, play remake first. There's a school of thought, if I may call it that, out there that has suggested that Rebirth has somehow nullified the necessity of remake or made it seem like a completely unnecessary prologue, and I could not disagree with that more. You can start at Rebirth, and I feel like they do enough exposition through dialogue that, if you're good at following stories, you can probably connect the dots and figure out what's going on. And you probably could skip remake, but I see absolutely no reason to do that. I do think that this is just going to be the definitive Final Fantasy VII experience when it's all said and done. But I do think, because of the quality, the combat, just really the quality of the dressings. When we break it down in the podcast, it's that how is it crafted as a piece of art, right? And it's just all of the pieces. Whether or not some people love what they did with certain twists and turns, and we've talked before about Whispers and all the other stuff, just everything from its graphics, music, the way the gameplay works, the voice acting, all of those little details are just so well done that, yeah. So we'll get back into more of that, but I did want to start with that one. Let's now jump into something much more specific, but a little bit similar. I was talking about more differences and similarities, right? Micah asks favorite new song and favorite rearrangement of a song from the OG. So let me start with the second one, because oddly enough, the first question is going to be tougher to answer, which I never would have expected as a gigantic Nobuo Uematsu stan, right? Most of you listening to this know, but Nobuo Uematsu is far and away my favorite musician of all time. Not my favorite Final Fantasy composer, not my favorite video game composer, not my favorite composer. My favorite musician of any kind, anywhere. And the rearrangements of some of his music in Rebirth are incredible, are phenomenal. I do have to give you two. One, I guess this is maybe a slight spoiler. I think most people saw, this was in the trailers, but Battle on the Big Bridge. I've heard so many versions of that over the years. They put like 42 of them in Theater Rhythm, and I never would have thought a new one could blow me away, and they did. But, and again, there's a bit of a spoiler here, so I won't dive too deep into what it is. But the final boss music was unlike anything I've ever heard before. I'm still blown away by it. I absolutely floored by it. I listen to it every once in a while just to make sure that it's real. That was a trip. Again, as somebody who has been listening to this music since it's existed for, 20 plus years now. And again, even all of the Final Fantasy music. And I've heard a ton of rearrangements of them. And some of them I've even covered or learned how to play, at least on some small level throughout the years. To hear these pieces, maybe a little bit of a spoiler there, come together. And it just, oh man, it was extraordinary. But the first part of the question deserves a lot of thought, because I felt like in Remake about half of the new music was really cool and good, and the other half of the new music didn't really do it for me. And it wasn't even that I thought that a lot of it was terrible, it was just that I thought some of it didn't fit. I didn't love the music that plays when you're in Wall Market in particular, and that's too bad because that can be a very interesting and moody place to be, and I just felt like the music didn't fit well. But holy cannoli. Beef and ravioli. Sorry, I'm becoming a dad already. The new stuff in Rebirth is insane. Especially good are the area world maps. Each one of the, Corel and Gungaga. I really, really love the Gungaga music a lot with the bagpipes. The music that plays in the first couple of area, in the first area and the last area, I think is mostly just a rearrangement of the main theme. But the rest of the times, Junon has some great, like, Pirates of the Caribbean inspired music going on, and I loved all of that stuff. And I always feel like I've got to give a special shout out to music that you hear a lot. Because you can be a great standout piece of music in, a video game or a movie that plays once and really grabs everybody's attention. But I feel like it's very, very difficult to be something that's going to play while you're out there roaming around in the open world for 150 to 200 hours of doing everything that this game has to offer. And those pieces, I feel like, were especially standouts. I also want to call attention to the bands that exist in each town, in each major city, I suppose I should say, particularly Gungaga. There's like a Celtic band playing in Gungaga that just melts my heart. It's absolutely beautiful. But, and I hate to be a homer here. I mean, I don't really. But on a soundtrack where there's only one original composition from the man himself, I do think that No Promises to Keep by Nobuo Uematsu, the song that Aerith sings, is once again the masterclass of the soundtrack. This is going to sound weird. It reminded me of that scene in House of the Dragon where all of the other powerful people have risen up and they're all like taking control of so many things and in many ways are already running things. And then the old decrepit king, sorry, Uematsu-san. This is an ugly analogy for everybody. The power struggle's not the same, but it's more like, all of these other composers have risen up after Uematsu. And so capably, so much more than capably, so masterfully, so with so much level of genius, created some incredible music for Final Fantasy in the post-Uematsu era. And Rebirth is, in my mind, their greatest achievement altogether, with apologies to Soken and his genius mastercraft that was 16. I think Rebirth is now the greatest Final Fantasy soundtrack of all time. And a lot of that is due to the new music that was made by the newer composers, and also their work on rearranging Uematsu's classics. But then it's like the old king walked into the room at the end of the story and said, I still got it. I'm still the master. The guy who wrote the prelude and the Final Fantasy theme and Aerith and Tifa's themes and One Winged Angel all those years ago with a new absolute banger. Man. Legend. Absolute legend. All right, let's do another favorite, and let's combine a couple of questions from the Discord Vader and on Twitter, the other one. Both asked me about my favorite character, and also, much like with the last question in music, my favorite new character. Also, Vader wanted to know specifically why it was Cid, and do I feel like he's a better Dragoon than the clown Justinian from Final Fantasy XIV, which is an inside joke that goes back to Final Fantasy Fight Club. Check that out if you missed all that stuff. But and Cid was great, by the way. Not yet one of my favorite characters, but I will say I love what they've done with Cid and Vincent so far. I think that much like with Red 13 and Remake, that really gets me excited for them to have a much bigger starring role in the final game here. But that really was appetizers for those guys. So there are a couple of different ways to think about this question. My favorite characters overall in general, which has always been a difficult question to ask. And if you know, I'm doing the literary thing, if I'm being the guy who's like, who's the most interesting character case study? It's still Cloud. It's still 100% Cloud. My God, is it even more Cloud than it's ever been? And it's always been Cloud. That said, I could not help myself with how much more I fell in love with some of these characters I either didn't love or weren't really big favorites before. I've talked a lot about Yuffie and Kate Sith. They really did get the biggest glow-ups. I think the Turks in general have just gotten to do a lot of great stuff, and I've mentioned Rufus Shinra before as somebody who's a far more interesting and three-dimensional character than what he was originally. And I think they've resisted the temptation to get too quickly to, what we've seen in Advent Children or whatever. Like, he's still a bastard. And I think that that's great. I really love what they've done with all those characters. Am I just about to name every single character in the game? Yeah, probably. Like, even from remake to rebirth, characters that I didn't love before, ironically enough, characters that other people seem to have turned on, like Johnny and Chadley. Love those guys now. Big Chadley fan, big My fan. I said it, and I stand by it. That's who I am, and that's what I believe. But I think in this one, it ended up being Nanaki. I think Red 13, Nanaki, whatever, Nanaki. I've always said Nanaki, and they said it Nanaki. I just absolutely loved everything that they did with that. Okay, so we're a little bit into spoiler territory here too, right? But the thing they did with the voice, I loved that. That was, to me, a perfect example of the kind of thing that you do in a story where before you didn't have voice acting. And it was always implied, but difficult to tell because translations are tough. And quite frankly, as a writer, I can tell you that it can be difficult to get tone in your writing. Now, if you go back and read the way Red 13 is written in that original game, before you get to Cosmo Canyon versus after, there's a change. He uses much younger language. But again, that can be harder to get across. There's a couple lines of dialogue about... They do this whole thing in the original too, right? Like he's actually younger than he's been pretending to be or whatever, right? With the age change and difference. But that he could actually change his voice, that to know that he was like putting on a big serious voice, and that he would then go back and forth. Like, I loved that addition. That's, to me, the perfect example of what is expounded upon that's always been there as a part of the lore of the character that now feels deeper and more real. And I think my favorite side quest in the entire game, again, spoilers because I think it's a little bit later on, was the one with the children's story and Red. Like, I cried, you guys. It was so beautiful. It was absolutely beautiful. And so, yeah, I just, all of those things I felt like were something. And again, maybe I'm giving bias to, because I already love the characters who were so well fleshed out before. Cloud, Tifa, Aerith, Barrett, all to me were top tier, S tier characters, Final Fantasy characters, and always have been. Where some of these other characters I felt like were always a little bit less developed. I would love to have seen more, and now we get so much more. And if anything, and there's a different version of this, and actually I'll let this lead me into the next question. What I love most about these characters in this game specifically, and more than probably any other Final Fantasy ever, is not the characters themselves, but the dynamics between them. How much Barrett and Yuffie have their unique dynamic, but Barrett and Red have their unique dynamic. Barrett gives both of those kids a hard time, but not in the same way. And then they both get along very deeply, but not in the same way. And none of that has anything to do with Cloud Strife. And I just, and that's true for everybody. Aerith and Red have a unique dynamic, don't they? Aerith and Barrett. Okay, so this gets me into this next question, right? Vicosio on Twitter asks, favorite synergy ability? Mine was Sweet and Sour Salvo. I don't remember the names of all of them, but yeah, Barrett and Aerith putting on the sunglasses and doing stuff, like all of them. Like with the favorite character question, my answer is all of them, but there were a few that just going through in my head stood out specifically to me. I love the one where Aerith kind of controls Red with her staff. Right, I found that. I just mentioned the sunglasses is obviously extraordinarily charming, but the two to me that just made me go wow were Tifa and Yuffie, because I am a mark for ninja stuff, right? Flippy nonsense. Absolute ridiculous acrobatic. So Tifa and Yuffie with the one where they end up like kicking Yuffie's saw blade style weapon into the quality, high quality stuff. But my favorite one of all of them was the Aerith in Tifa 1, where Aerith just creates the massive magical barrier for Tifa to do all of her ninja nonsense off of, and it just fills my heart with joy. But again, these things I feel like they're not just fun, pretty video game mechanics that make the combat more fun and interesting and also the screen nice to look at. To me, it added to each character. It added to their interpersonal dynamics. It made everyone feel like they were going on this big, grand adventure together and that they were always there. And I can't remember if I said this on the other show, but I do think ultimately that's my favorite thing about this game, as it perhaps stands out particularly above even the rest of the franchise. Not that you necessarily have to think of it that way, but Ira and I have long talked about how it can be frustrating when you've got to leave a few party members behind, when, the limitations of only having 3 in battle at any given time. You could feel certain characters would get lost, and if you didn't particularly like using them in battle or whatever, you could forget they were even there after a fashion in some of the old games. And, in this one, it just... Yes, and because even the way it's visually presented, everyone's there as you're traveling. They're in the background kind of firing in random magic-y nonsense that's not really doing anything. But what it is doing is making the team always feel like a team. And that enhances every chapter of every story. It enhances every battle. It enhances every side quest. It was just extraordinary. So yeah, that's definitely my favorite part of Rebirth. As far as new characters, I thought about this for a little while, because Rebirth itself doesn't actually have a ton of new characters, right? Because my original thought was like, well, Roche, I really like what's been going on there, right? Madam M and all that stuff. But those characters were introduced in Remake. And so... the only one I could really think of that played a big role off the top of my head was Glenn Lodbrok, right? This character. And I thought that was very, very interesting. It ultimately did go kind of exactly where I thought it was going to, which that's okay. Sometimes that's very satisfying, and it was, but, ultimately I don't think it quite stood out to me in the way that some of the other characters have that have added a new dynamic. So, that one is maybe an area where I had never really thought about it, and I don't think, as I've often said, it's hard for me to criticize something for not doing an extra and having even more totally brand new characters to the lore is, in my view, an extra, but there wasn't a lot of that. And the one they did have, again, I didn't think it was bad by any means, but, ultimately, there are enough interesting villains in this story already that adding a new element, ranking in the top 10 or whatever the most interesting villains in this story alone is going to be hard enough as it is, really. Okay, so just, full disclosure, I did want to bring up a list of characters to see if there's anything that I forgot about that I did want to mention before moving on from characters. Somebody who was new, Broden, the guy from the inn at the beginning. I thought that was really interesting. That introduced a cool dynamic to it, and being able to see someone go through the process, right? That was really, really cool. Cisne was not new to Final Fantasy VII in general. That's a Crisis Core character, but she is new to this re-trilogy, and I loved this version of Cisne, and I liked the way a lot of what they did with the Crisis Core story was, if you know, you know, and if you don't, there are a couple of hints in there, but they didn't spell it out for anybody, and I thought that was actually pretty darned cool. And another character that had a huge glow up that I really was not expecting to enjoy at all was Dio. I didn't think I was ever going to like Dio of the Gold Saucer, but ladies and gentlemen, are you not entertained? I certainly was. So, I mean, just across the board. Bugenhagen. I know some people, I've seen a little bit on the internet, some people saying they didn't like what, they did with Cosmo Canyon, making it feel like sort of hippy-dippy and them kind of being mean to Tifa a little bit and talking down on other people's beliefs. But again, I felt like that all of that was consistent with the original, and a little bit of a, Bugenhagen was always a little bit of a, woo-hoo-hoo, you don't know anything, let me explain everything. And then by the end he's going, oh, maybe I don't know anything either. That was always part of the point of the Bugenhagen character. And so, yeah, I really didn't think, it's like, no, I don't want them to, be mean to any of our characters. But I do think that, it can also be a little bit troublesome to present one group of people as uniformly enlightened above everybody else either. And so, I don't think that that's realistic or reasonable, but I do still think that they, to me, they just come off as maybe a little too into their beliefs, but that's, again, very realistic to me for a group of people who have kind of separated their own society based on those beliefs. And so, yeah, I can 100% understand not loving it, but I did. All right, let's get to this other question that came in from the Discord while we're talking favorites and things. Oh, no, this one's on Twitter, also from the other one, who asked, what is the best minigame and why is it Queen's Blood? You're right, it is. So I'm going to slightly adjust your question and talk about the other ones. Real quickly, though, man, Queen's Blood was a lot of fun. I think it probably now takes the top spot in terms of all Final Fantasy minigames. Well, for me now, and this is a controversial take, I love Blitzball. I love Blitzball. And so now it's been a little while since I've played it. Would I be as tolerant of some of its mechanics today as I was back then? And I've played it since then. It's not like I haven't touched the thing since 10 came out. They've had several remasters and things like that over the years. I've replayed the game, and I still like Blitzball a lot. But I think, and Triple Triad, but I think Queen's Blood is better than Triple Triad as a game. I just really did get into it. I did the whole thing, the entire quest. I loved that too, that there was even a quest built around it. But yeah, a fantastic minigame. So what was the best of the rest? This is actually harder to answer because, well, I probably enjoyed all of them. I did do a tweet about how, except for, the chicken one, but that was hilarious. Like, that was a troll job. That was almost them going, yeah, we know we put a bunch of mini games in it, and we're just going to see if you do this one last thing, and then we're all going to have a big joke and laugh about it. And so I thought that was funny. The only one I truly, epically, and utterly hated was the 3D fighter in the Gold Saucer, which, to be fair, was true to the original, because I've always hated that 3D fighter, and it's too bad because it looks so fun and cool. Like, I love visually looking at it, even in the old one. I love that, but man, I hated that. By the way, cheat for you. If you are having a hard time, get through that one, pause. The second the other guy starts to move, pause, and then pause again until you see what they're going to do, and then that's the only way I was able to get through it. I hated that. The rest of them, I loved. Motorcycle racing continues to be a lot of fun, right? Motorcycle racing / fighting, right? I really like the Space Ranger game. I liked the Chocobo racing I did for a long, long time. Absolutely love that. That's probably the best of the rest. They got a pretty solid little racer in there. I wish that the now I'm forgetting the name of it, the Rocket League knockoff that you play with Red, I wish there was a little bit more of that. I feel like that could have stolen the show in terms of mini games. Now maybe there is on like harder mode, and I need to go in and play more of that, because I really like the mechanics in general of that. Now I'm a big Rocket League fan, and I'm a sports guy, so maybe that has something to do with it as well. But I had a lot of fun with that. Fort Condor remains a lot of fun. I don't know if I Fort Condored myself out with the DLC, because I didn't do as much of it in Rebirth. There was also just obviously so much else on offer. Oh, the piano. Goodness gracious. As a musician, I love the piano minigame. It was more difficult at times than I thought it would be. And some of the rhythmic choices of like where they chose to put the notes really threw me off at first, but when I was able to just kind of let go and not play the notes as they were in my head, but just as they appeared on screen, I was able to get through that. But I love that they put a music mini game in, which again is an expansion upon something that was in the original, which was that you could play the piano, but you couldn't really play the piano. Right now you can. So yeah, man, of the Queen's Blood still stands out above the rest because it was clearly so, deeply developed or whatever. But I do love that you can, and I put this on the Everything is Final Fantasy YouTube page, right? I played Terra's theme from Final Fantasy VI on the piano. It's a bit herky-jerky. I do feel like, again, that there was maybe a way to have perfected that a little bit better, but you can go online and find all kinds of videos of people playing all kinds of cool stuff on the piano, and the fact that you can just do more or less anything. There are certain complicated music things. It's just not feasible to be like switching keys quickly in the middle of the song unless there's a big break or whatever. You can slow things down, but man, it's just kind of wild they put a fully interactive piano into the game. Like, there's so much they didn't need to do that in Rebirth that they just did anyway, and it turned out awesome. And that's one of the bigger ones. Andy asks, which chocobos are my favorite? The Cosmo Canyon ones. I like that. Well, no, maybe the ones that shoot around on the water. I don't know. I love all chocobos equally and wonderfully. I do like, just from a color standpoint, the green and like turquoise blue. Like, I'm a big fan of that. And I think that that's the one that I ultimately ended up using, in my chocobo races at the Gold Saucer. I'm pretty sure is the one from Cosmo Canyon. I almost feel bad that I can't remember all of their names, honestly. I loved all of that stuff too. Oh, there's new characters for you. All of the chocobos that got names. And the fact that the Moogles exist in the real world in this version of Final Fantasy VII and not just at the Gold Saucer. Though presumably, if you're making, an amusement park attraction out of something, it might exist out there in the world. As I'm saying that, I realize that we do stuff with like unicorns and Godzilla and things like that that don't exist, right? So they could have always been fictional beings in the world of Final Fantasy VII, but now they exist out there in the world. And so they're all new and have, Moogle names. So that was a lot of fun. Okay, I'm over a half an hour now, so I'm going to save a couple of these final questions and a few other topics for a wrap-up podcast, finish out Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and then my brother and I are going to get back into finishing out Final Fantasy VIII. So thank you all for listening in. I'm going to make this one free again because these are a little bit extra, so I appreciate you listening in, especially if it's your first time. You can subscribe for free, by the way, on Patreon, and just, give me a little membership subscription and check out all the free content. There's quite a bit of stuff on here that is free, but also the vast majority of it is available for just $1 a month. Over 100 Final Fantasy podcasts. We've also got some podcasts on like Studio Ghibli and just other random fun movies that my brother and I watched when we were kids and things like that. So maybe consider throwing us a $1 subscription. Also get you access to the Discord channel where you can more easily participate in conversations like this, ask questions, and just be tagging along for the ride as we're doing Final Fantasy stuff. So thank you all for listening in. I hope you will continue to be absolutely awesome out there. I will continue to be absolutely Drew Creasman in here. And until next time, I will see you out there in the world.